On the morning of the 23rd of December 1984, millions of people across Britain were preparing for Christmas. Presents had been bought, food was being prepared, and children were counting down the hours until Father Christmas arrived. Few people spared a thought for the freight trains still moving across the country, carrying the goods and fuel that kept Britain running. But that Sunday morning, one of those trains was carrying something far more dangerous than parcels and presents. It was carrying over 1 million litres of petrol. And before the day was out, it would create one of the largest and most spectacular railway fires in British history. This is the story of the Summit Tunnel Fire. Our story begins nearly a century and a half earlier. Opened in 1841, Summit Tunnel was one of the great engineering achievements of the Victorian age. Stretching for almost 1.5 miles between Littleborough and Todmorden, it had taken thousands of labourers years of hard and dangerous work to complete. By the time the last brick had been laid, 41 men had lost their lives building it. For generations of railwaymen, it became simply another part of the landscape, a dark passage beneath the Pennines through which countless trains passed every day, carrying everything from passengers and coal to freight and dangerous chemicals. By 1984, nobody imagined that the tunnel itself would one day become the centre of a national emergency. Shortly before 7 o'clock that morning, a freight train left the Lindsey oil refinery in Lincolnshire. The train consisted of a diesel locomotive and 13 tank wagons loaded with petrol. Together they carried more than 1 million litres of fuel. At the controls were driver Stanley Marshall and guard Graham Broadbent. Also on board was area guard Stanley Smalley, who was simply hitching a ride home. It was a cold winter morning and the route ahead was a familiar one, just another routine freight journey a few days before Christmas. The train approached Summit Tunnel, and there was nothing to suggest that anything was wrong. But as it disappeared into the darkness, one of the wagons suffered a catastrophic axle bearing failure. The damaged tanker left the rails, and in an instant several of the wagons behind it were dragged from the track. Steel screamed against brickwork as the derailed tankers slammed into the tunnel walls and crashed into one another. Somewhere in the chaos, the first tanker ruptured, quickly followed by another. Petrol began pouring onto the track and spreading through the confined space of the tunnel. And then, without warning, came a flash. Within seconds, the leaking petrol ignited and a huge fireball erupted inside the tunnel. Realising that the train was on fire, Marshall and his crew brought the locomotive to a halt. Clambering down from the cab, the 3 men ran the remaining mile through the tunnel to the south portal, where an emergency telephone allowed them to raise the alarm. And before long, the first fire crews were arriving at the tunnel. Only when they turned back did they see the full scale of the disaster unfolding behind them. Moments earlier, they had been making a routine journey through the Pennines. Now they stood at the mouth of the tunnel, watching flames roar from the darkness and thick black smoke billow into the winter sky. Behind the curtain of fire, more tankers were failing, spilling yet more fuel into the blaze, and feeding an inferno that seemed to grow with every passing minute. The response from both fire brigades was remarkable. Crews from West Yorkshire and Greater Manchester were on the scene within minutes, immediately searching for ways to tackle the blaze, while other emergency workers evacuated around 170 nearby homes. Before the fire reached its full fury, firefighters were able to establish that the locomotive and the first 3 wagons had remained on the rails. They asked Marshall, Broadbent and Smalley if they would be willing to return to the tunnel and pull them clear. Without hesitation, all 3 men agreed, carrying out an extraordinary act of courage that removed more than 250,000 litres of petrol from the heart of the disaster. As the fire continued to grow, both brigades tried different ways of attacking it. Greater Manchester firefighters began pouring high-expansion foam down ventilation shaft number 7 in the hope of smothering the flames, while their colleagues from West Yorkshire directed powerful jets of water into the tunnel and laid blankets of foam over the burning fuel. For a time it appeared that they might be gaining the upper hand. However, few could fully appreciate what they were facing. Nobody knew exactly what was happening beyond the curtain of smoke. Some of the tankers had survived the derailment, but no one could say how many. No one knew whether more wagons might rupture or whether the fire would trigger further explosions. There was also a growing fear that the intense heat could seriously damage the old brick-lined tunnel itself. As the scale of the emergency became clear, more and more firefighters were called to the scene. Eventually, more than 150 men would become involved in the operation. Then, without warning, the fire developed with terrifying speed. An explosion around one of the tank wagons sent huge fireballs racing along the roof of the tunnel until they reached the ventilation shafts above. Moments later, the Pennine countryside was lit by an extraordinary sight as great columns of flame burst from shafts 8, 9 and 10, shooting more than 150 feet into the air. To those watching outside, it must have seemed as though the hillside itself had caught fire. Inside the tunnel, conditions had become intolerable. The Inferno had transformed the old railway tunnel into an oven, and the firefighters had no choice but to withdraw. Later, West Yorkshire's Deputy Chief Fire Officer would say that had those ventilation shafts not been there to vent the fire, many of his men might have been burned alive. Within a remarkably short time, the battle had changed completely. The heat pouring from the tunnel was intense, reaching an estimated 1500 degrees C, an environment so extreme that steel warped, bricks melted, and sections of the train were left unrecognisable. No firefighter could safely enter. The great Victorian structure had become a giant furnace, and all anyone could do was watch and wait as the Inferno continued to burn. Hour after hour, the flames raged within the tunnel. Then daylight faded, and darkness returned to the Pennines, and still the fire showed no sign of dying. Fire crews worked around the clock, pumping vast quantities of water from the nearby canal into the tunnel in an attempt to cool the fire and protect the structure. Outside the tunnel, an anxious vigil began to form. Residents watched the great plume of smoke rising into the winter sky and wondered what exactly was burning beneath the hills. Rumours spread quickly. Some feared that further explosions were inevitable, while railway officials worried that the intense heat might bring down one of Britain's greatest works of engineering. There was another concern too. More than 1 million litres of petrol had been involved in the fire, and nobody knew what effect the blaze and the thousands of gallons of contaminated firefighting water would have on the surrounding environment. If the fuel escaped into nearby watercourses, the damage could extend far beyond the tunnel itself. By the afternoon of the following day, the great Inferno had finally been brought under control. But the battle was far from over. Pockets of fire continued to flare up for days, and it would not be until the evening of Christmas Eve that firefighters finally declared the blaze extinguished. In total, more than 800,000 litres of petrol were consumed by the fire, fuel worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, and enough to fill hundreds of family cars many times over. Given the scale of what happened, perhaps the most remarkable fact of all was that nobody had been killed. More than 140 years after men had died carving the tunnel, no new names would be added to that tragic roll of honour. Even after the flames had finally been extinguished, the work was far from over. Environmental teams spent days containing polluted water and removing fuel residues, while the surrounding area was carefully monitored to ensure that the disaster did not leave a second, quieter legacy in the streams and countryside around Summit Tunnel. The investigation that followed eventually traced the disaster back to a single wheel set on the fourth wagon. Investigators concluded that a journal bearing had seized, generating enormous heat before the axle finally failed and the wheel collapsed, derailing the trailer. The damage to the track and the violence of the derailment then pulled the wagons behind it from the rails and set in motion the chain of events that followed. The failure was especially troubling because the wheel set had been fitted only weeks earlier. The bearings had been reconditioned rather than new, a perfectly acceptable practice at the time, and investigators were unable to identify any individual error. In truth, they were left with an uncomfortable conclusion. A rare and catastrophic mechanical failure had occurred in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. The train fared badly in the fire. Some wheels had become literally welded to the rails by the heat. Others had melted and deformed into strange teardrop shapes. Wagon frames had been twisted and buckled, and entire sections of the train had been reduced to a blackened mass of scorched metal. But perhaps the greatest surprise of all came with the tunnel itself. After burning for more than 2 days, many expected to find catastrophic structural damage. Surely no brick-lined tunnel could survive temperatures like these. Yet engineers discovered something remarkable. Despite the unimaginable temperatures inside, against all expectations, the 143-year-old tunnel still stood strong. There was some damage, of course. Some bricks had become so hot that they had partially melted and run like liquid glass down the walls. Around several of the ventilation shafts, the brickwork had vitrified and collapsed onto the wreckage below. And yet the structural integrity of Summit Tunnel had never been seriously threatened. It was an extraordinary testament to Victorian engineering. Repairs began almost immediately, and, in another remarkable achievement, trains were once again passing through Summit Tunnel just 8 months later. The fire had caused enormous disruption, but the route had been saved. The Summit Tunnel fire also left a lasting legacy. It forced Britain's railways to take a fresh look at the risks involved in moving dangerous goods, and prompted renewed attention to wagon maintenance, emergency planning, and the procedures needed to deal with incidents involving hazardous cargo. It also demonstrated the importance of cooperation between the railways, firefighters, and environmental agencies when dealing with large industrial accidents. Today, passengers still pass through Summit Tunnel without giving it a second thought. For most, it is simply another dark stretch of railway. But hidden within those bricks is the memory of a fire that once threatened to destroy one of Britain's great engineering landmarks. A routine freight journey became a national emergency. An ordinary Sunday before Christmas became a battle against an inferno. And a Victorian tunnel built nearly a century and a half earlier refused to yield to the flames. Sometimes disasters leave behind ruins. Sometimes they leave behind lessons. And sometimes they leave behind a quiet reminder that the things we build and the people who build them can prove far stronger than we ever imagine. Now, although a lot of men lost their lives actually building the tunnel a century and a half earlier, thankfully in this incident there was no loss of life. I hope you appreciated the way the information was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.